Again, it's it's a Friday morning, so I again appreciate folks braving Friday traffic to come out. I'm Oliver Wang. I'm one of the co-chairs for the conference. That's Karen Thompson, who's another of the co-chairs. And just some quick thanks in terms of how this was possible. Certainly, Karen was able to help us with USC and the Tudor Center for donating the space and the time today, which is fantastic and amazing. Big thanks to Cal Arts, who did the design for our posters. And it sort of helped out innumerably with venues and design aspects. Big thanks to our conference committee, which includes Erica Flores up here, Ned Raggett, who is our social media guru for the day, and thank you to the panelists for coming as well. And this conference is normally kind of a big national thing, and this is the first time they've tried to regionalize it, and we have done it in a very DIY way, which seems very apropos for the theme. So please forgive our little blips along the way, but I think we're off and running. Thank you.
All right, so good morning and welcome everybody, and I hope everybody got some coffee and pastries and some breakfast and got settled. And again, thank you for your patience in indulging us and getting started. But we're going to go ahead and just kick things off. So we're going to start with Drew Tewksbury, and I'm going to read everybody's bio from what they submitted, so spare me a moment here. Drew is the managing editor and producer of KCET Public Media's Artbound Transmedia project and produces monthly on-air music review pieces for KPCC's Take Two show. For 2 years, he wrote daily posts for LA Weekly's music blog, West Coast Sound, and he has written or produced pieces for LA Times, NPR, Filter, Flaunt, and NME. He is a graduate of USC's Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism's graduate program. So, Drew, when you are ready, I guess we're going to
all right.
share that microphone.
Okay. Sorry. Pass me the mic. Thank you. That's great. All right. Can you hear me okay? So I'm Drew Tewksbury, and thanks a lot for coming out. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to take you kind of on a video and audio DJ set right now. We're going to go through a couple videos, we're going to hear some things, and we're going to go through some ideas as well. So it's no secret that public schools in Southern California are having trouble funding the arts. It's an adage we often hear. When faced with funding arts and music classes or science and math classes, schools typically choose the latter of the two. But according to a recent survey, arts may just be where the jobs are. In the 2012 report on the creative economy of Los Angeles, released by the Otis College of Art and Design, a few facts were learned about our city. First, 1 in 8 jobs in LA is in the creative economy. Secondly, the total economic impact in LA and Orange County of the creative economy is $230 billion. And third, 42% of creative jobs are related to the entertainment industry, and 9% of those jobs are in visual and performing arts. So if there are jobs in the creative economy, and schooling is intended to prepare students for the job market, it would stand to reason that schools should teach students how to partake in creative industries. But often that's not the case. So maybe traditional schooling isn't the only answer. After all, knowledge has changed. The acquisition of knowledge has evolved in the internet era. The established hierarchy of teachers and students has broken down. Traditionally, a teacher or an elder, the person with the most and often most expensive education, was the dispenser of knowledge. Now, savvy people, or as I like to call them, students 2.0, are the ones who can navigate systems to find the right person with the right answers. If you've taught a class recently, you've seen that students often mitigate their learning through devices. Memorization isn't as important as it used to be, but discerning how to access valuable information is key. Schools are kind of old school. Learning networks are the future of education and spreading cultural knowledge. For homegrown musical education, there seems to be two kinds of networks. One is online, and the other one is in real life, so to speak. Later, we'll talk about the real-life learning networks, but for now, we'll start with online networks. For music that exists outside the canon of high art, autodidacts and do-it-yourselfers create musical ideas and techniques and distribute their works online through several different venues. Through YouTube and online videos, young musicians utilize the internet as a free university to hone their skills as EDM producers, heavy metal singers, or mariachi guitarists. Some established acts also share secrets of their trade, like electronic music producer Thavius Beck, who conducts master classes on how to create music on beat mixing programs. Here he is teaching a master class on electronic dance music.
Hello, everybody. This is Ableton Live certified trainer and dubspot instructor, Dave. Today I'm going to talk to you about my own personal way of chopping up samples in Ableton Live. One of the beautiful things about Ableton is that it gives you a variety of ways to do the exact same thing, depending on your preference and your workflow. So I have a session set up with a drum break that I've worked. I'll play this for you really quick so you can see what it is. And if I turn on my metronome, you'll see that it works, so that's drum beat.
Okay, so you get the idea. So EDM is a musical genre that isn't taught in schools. Sorry. EDM is a musical genre that isn't often taught in schools. Popular music tends to be unpopular in some education programs. The classics, typically European composers, still reign. For those who don't share the cultural attachment to Bach or Beethoven, there's not much to identify with. Which brings me to the idea that some studies have called interest-based learning. That students who are interested in a subject will spend more time studying it rather than something that is uninteresting to them. It's the case that some of us had in middle school, where we were taught to play the recorder, and we'd never practice, and instead go home and spend 5 hours playing guitar at home. These are both two different kinds of learning. But one causes a sense of dread, and the other one makes you fall in love with music, which is a lifelong experience for many. Loving music is what builds lasting communities that often bridge cultural divides. An example of an interest-based music community that I've been following pretty closely is definitely not taught in school. It's death metal. There's no books on how there's no books telling aspiring death metal heads how to execute a gut-wrenching grumble. Instead, the University of Metal, so to speak, is online. For people who want to learn how to perform a nice death metal grunt, online videos offer many tips from bedroom metalheads. Here's a clip of a surly-looking guy in his bedroom teaching 3 different versions of death metal grunts. All right, we'll turn it sort of down. This one's my favorite.
Big squeal.
Okay. So we've seen how culture is spread through online videos and peer-to-peer video. So we've seen how culture is spread through online videos and peer-to-peer videos. But musical knowledge also spreads through real-life meetups organized through social networks. Venues act as a kind of educational space where musicians perform and share musical works that are often developed in solitude. Los Angeles club Low End Theory is a kind of producer's lounge in the Airliner Club in Lincoln Heights. I spoke with electronic musician Flying Lotus in 2009 about growing up in the San Fernando Valley and how he learned to make the music that he makes today, especially focusing on the role of low-end theory.
Place to grow up, man.
Can you increase the volume on there because otherwise it's static.
I mean, well, this sort of thing I was into. I meet so many creative people coming up. Everyone was kind of right in line with everything else. You go to school and you get a decent job, get married, and have kids, whatever. A lot of people were on the seriously trying to make some art happen. At least in my circle of friends, really. You know, a lot of my friends were athletes, and I was the guy playing Nintendo. So, you know, I was definitely the outcast amongst my friends. But, you know, all that time spent at home, you know, I was tinkering around with art, you know, whether it was, you know, visual art or music, and, you know, just, it was my escape from everything. you know, when I first started getting in the mix here, and you know, there was enough of us to kind of get frustrated at the scene that was happening here. You know, a bunch of us guys, we all kind of get together and play tracks, and out in the parking lots of clubs, just kicking it. And you know, we'd eventually get these little beat showcases here and there where we could do this sort of thing. And then eventually there was this party that started called Low End Theory that was geared towards the sound, you know, and more of a producer's lounge, basically, you know. And it's been a great forum for a lot of young producers to show their stuff. It's a really inspiring place. You know, you go there, and it's hard for me to stay longer than an hour now because I'll hear some shit and be like, oh my gosh, and you go back and work on something, you know.
East LA's Son Jarocho band Las Cafeteras also learned their art outside of the classroom too, through a community center in El Sereno called Eastside Cafe. There they practiced their vibrant folk music from Veracruz, Mexico, and filtered it through their Angelino experiences. I met up with Hector Flores from the band, and here he is talking about their story.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Hector Flores. I'm with the band Las Cafeteras, and I'm also a member of the Eastside Cafe here program. I'm part of Las Cafeteras, and Las Cafeteras are actually named after the Eastside Cafe. So we used to be always at marches, at community centers, and we never had a name, and people would always say, oh, I mean los cafeteros del cafe, you know, the coffee makers of the Eastside Cafe. And then, you know, we one day just took the name Las Cafeteras, and that's what we became, the community name list. And we actually were born out of a struggle in South Central. It was the South Central Farm. It was a 14-acre piece of land, the largest urban farm in the United States, and we were fighting to keep it community owned. And every given night during that movement to keep that farm, you could find spoken word, dance azteca, son jarocho, right? And even though we ultimately lost the space, we wanted to keep those elements alive, elements of music, of dance, of culture, and so we wanted a place to do that. And Eastside Cafe opened up its arms and said, we can have the classes here. And individual teachers said, we'd like to teach son jarocho here to keep that movement alive. And so Las Cafeteras now, who the members now learn how to play. I was not a musician. I didn't know how to play music before I learned here at the Eastside Cafe. This is where I learned how to theory, how to strum my hand, how to sing without judgment. They didn't tell you to sing to sound good, they told you to sing to feel free. So I was born in City Terrace, which is in East LA, right off the 10th Freeway, but I also grew up around San Diego Valley and all the different neighborhoods there. And I remember in middle school and high school, like, there were music classes. There was like one class that if you didn't get into that one class, then, well, you didn't play music. And so, you know, I never grew up playing music. I loved it, but, like, no one had money for instruments, and all my homies didn't have instruments, and so that's what it was. And it wasn't until I came to this place, Eastside Cafe, where someone was able to teach, one, for free, because they wanted the neighborhood and people who live in the neighborhood to learn how to sing, dance, and play. And there's someone who's committed to teaching and learning, and so that's revolutionary, right? Like, you can't, I think for a long time, people tell like working class communities what you can't do, you can't sing, you can't play, you can't do this. And here it was really about, yes, what you can do, what you can become. And I was 22 years old when I learned how to play. I'm 30 now. You know, and so it's such a beautiful honor and space, and that's why I'm still here.
So to sum up, we've seen many alternative venues for education, and I want to return to the idea of decentralized learning. Eastside Cafe was founded on the Zapatista model. So in that spirit, I want to end with a few thoughts from their manifesto that could help classrooms of the future. We want a world where many worlds fit. Construct, don't destroy. Convince, don't defeat. And lead by obeying. Thanks.
All right, we have time to take one question while we get ready for the next presentation. If anybody has a question they want to ask. Anybody? All right, then I'm going to take the chance to ask a question.
Oh, sure.
Because this is a little bit self-serving, I'm going to admit. Because I run a rock camp for girls in LA, so it's sort of similar to what you're discussing. because our background is actually we have a lot of different types of instructors that come from all different types of musical backgrounds. Some of us are professional musicians, and some, like me, I've been playing for 20 years, but the extent of my musical knowledge is like every good boy does fine, and that's all I know. I can't read like a music. So how would that type of instructional model sort of fit in with what you're talking about?
Well, so much of it is that, like, how you talk as being a kid not learning how to read music,
mm-hmm.
and how that frustrates you, and then you feel like you can't make music.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really that idea of empowering people by helping them to love music first. Because if
Right.
you love it, then you'll become obsessed, and that's the thing that you, every day you go home and play the guitar, you know, sit down in front of the stereo and listen to things and really take it apart, and that changes your whole life, as opposed to just being frustrated and never coming back to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Dick, are you ready?
Yeah,
Sure.
switch across here, sorry.
You guys just switch seats.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
Super high tech.
It's all you, man.
All right, while Derek is getting situated, I will give his introduction. Derek Papa will be going next, and he is a graduate student in public history at California State University, Fullerton. And on his master's project, he is conducting an oral history project on all ages grassroots collective style music venues throughout Southern California. He is specifically interested in venues in suburban locations like Orange County, San Diego, and Riverside. He resides in Los Angeles.
Is that coming through there?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, take this. Right, thanks for being here this morning. So I became interested in researching Orange County grassroots venues really because of this ongoing perception that I've heard for so long, that Orange County was a place of hyper-conservatism, and that it lacked culture, and that it existed behind what people refer to as this orange curtain. I thought, if this is true, then there must be a really interesting story about how the youth culture dealt with this, how they existed in this overly conservative sort of concrete environment, and an environment that seemed to cater more towards adults than it did to youth. Conducting my research using oral history was a way to really get behind the motivations of the individuals that developed a music scene and who built community for themselves, and in doing so changed the lives of so many people. My paper focuses on two grassroots collective style venues, Coos Cafe of Santa Ana and Our House of Costa Mesa, and the two individuals, Dennis Huey and Chris Fahey, who set these venues up. So I basically set out to find a counter narrative to this orange curtain myth. And these two individuals, by the way, are they operated completely separate from each other. They did not know each other. One was in, again, coastal Costa Mesa. The other one was in Santa Ana. So my narrators, that I interviewed these two folks, and I plan to interview some more, they really drive this narrative, so I'll be quoting them a lot, because this was an oral history project. So Chris Fahey describes his early motivations as a grassroots concert promoter, saying, "We had to give the people what we want." Santa Ana native Dennis Huey speaks similarly to his early efforts during the 90s, putting on alternative music shows, saying, I thought nobody's going to give it to us. I didn't expect anyone to create it for me. I just felt I should create it. I just responded to my own personal needs and did things I felt would improve my life. And it just so happens that it's what many other people wanted as well. Throughout the early 90s, Orange County was virtually void of all ages venues. Recognizing this insufficiency of music space for the youth, Huey and Fahey pulled their resources within arm's reach and established public places to put on shows from emerging local and national artists. Grassroots efforts like these, Huey reflects, is how community developed, doing shows wherever they could for anyone who would let them do it. They booked punk, indie pop, folk noise, 90s alternative music at unconventional, nondescript music venues. These included anything from Mexican restaurants, churches, the Elks Lodge, warehouses down by the tracks, and hotels. And in most cases, these spaces were on the outskirts of town. So amidst the sprawling suburbia, Huey and Fahey continued a long American tradition of carving out space for the creation of music. not only did they create a space for people to be entertained, but they also created a space for emerging genres to make their way into mainstream pop culture. To echo the Jabberjaw panel from the other night, young bands cut their teeth in these kinds of venues. They made their mistakes here, they played their worst shows, and they honed their craft, hopefully. I think it's important to point out here, kind of being grounded in history, I always have to try to be historical somehow. But throughout American history, unconventional music spaces have cradled these infant stages of artists. African American communities in the Deep South during the 19th century performed in juke houses, street corners, in the middle of fields. Elvis Presley, as we all know, performed his early shows in a flatbed truck in the Katz drugstore parking lot. Seattle's grunge music, makeshift spaces hosted the emergence of grunge. Mike Dillard from the Melvins remembers playing in a thriftway parking lot, finding basically a source for electricity out in the parking lot and plugging in, and that's where Kurt Cobain witnessed and said, "This is what I want to do." So yes, the same thing happened in Orange County. The youth found a space for young bands to do this, and these all-age grassroots venues broke up the monotony of endless, sprawling Southern California suburbia, which was really adult-centered. So Dennis remarked that during the 80s as a kid, I just want to set the scene before these venues brought up and what Orange County was like in the 80s as these kids were growing up. He remembers at a very early age that there wasn't much to do. He remembers saving their money, buying cheap instruments. He said music was our lives at that point. Anything from The Clash to Jimi Hendrix to the Beatles to Firehose. Skateboarding was the other outlet, but there were no skate parks. So what they did was they found a bunch of craters and parks and just skated whatever they could, and that was pretty much their lives. As a youth obsessed with playing and hearing new music, life quickly became frustrating. Quote, "That was the problem. There would be backyard parties, but before we even got the chance to play in most instances, the cops would break it up, so it really got frustrating. Most of the shows we did have were at churches and, again, non-conventional places." While there were a few all-ages venues in Southern California, like Spanky's in Riverside and Macondo in L.A., there was no place in Orange County, and it was obviously they can't always drive, so they really needed to create it in Orange County. Churches were host to many shows. At 15 years old, Dennis recalls taking extreme measures to play a show at a church. The Victory Outreach Church on Palm Street in Santa Ana. Skateboarding one day, they heard music coming out of this church, and they said, "What do we need to play here?" And basically said, if your lyrics reflect God and Jesus, then you've got a gig. So they went home and recorded about 3 songs and put Jesus in the chorus, and they got their gig. So that's how hungry they were to play. Soon Dennis realized that his calling was less in performing music, and he wanted to organize. So he put his first show on at the Elks Lodge in Fullerton. Game Face and Sam I Am were booked, and he said kids just went crazy. Bottle rockets went off, the hillside went on fire, fire department came, so the Elks got totally freaked out, and that was the end of that. So he moved on to find another place and a space to do shows, which was the Ice House in Fullerton. The Ice House was also presented a lot of problems. It was a pay-to-pay style venue, so it really didn't have any kind of hope for longevity. And he ran into a lot of problems with, at that time, there was a lot of tension between skinheads and sharps, and there was, at a Vandal show, there was a big riot and someone was stabbed, so that sort of ended the Ice House shows. So on to Koo's Cafe, which was really his effort to find a permanent space. He said, "One thing I learned with Koo's is nothing brings people together like music. Reflecting on one of the most memorable events at Koo's, Dennis describes a show played by Mesa, Arizona's Jimmy Eat World. There were over 400 kids. People were singing outside with the band. People were watching the band through the windows from outside. It was chaos, kids everywhere outside, overflowing into the front and backyard. When Dennis and his two young business partners walked into this tiny craftsman-style Coos Cafe for the first time, they encountered thick layers of flaking wallpaper and grease-infested carpet. Previously a Chinese takeout family restaurant, the building was owned and occupied by a long-standing local Chinese family that, quote, seemed open to rent to us. The health inspector had a list of hundreds of different items needed to be improved, and we had no money, so we all got together, scrapped it all together with elbow grease. Dennis and other volunteers scraped off the wallpaper, demoed the linoleum, and ripped out the greasy rugs, and replaced it with brightly blue-painted walls and celestial themes, all crafted by the hands of volunteers that would eventually make up the Coos Collective. It was always a collaborative effort, Dennis says. Many people inspired that venue. When asked why he picked that building, they were the only ones who would let us do it, he says. Because the city didn't have any classifications for the business model, it came under the premise of a coffee shop. We just called it a coffee shop. So under the disguise of a coffee shop and with the backing of a few local officials, Don Cribb being one of them, they gave us a shop. So the Coos was a collective in every sense of the word. It was stageless, so it had this idea that they wanted the crowd to be on the same level as the performers, to delete any of that hierarchical, someone is above someone else. Volunteer run, DIY in every sense of the word. None of them knew how to make coffee when they opened it, so they went to garage sales and found a coffee maker and figured out how to do it. Musically, I found this interesting. They refused to limit themselves to certain genres. He purposely booked events with different genres. He said he started to notice that bands would start collaborating with one another: hardcore, punk, Spanish rock, many kinds of metal, emo, indie, hip-hop. There was a band, Zebrahead, that got their start at Coos. They kind of meshed it together, this kind of metal hip-hop. Coos' open-minded philosophy helped previous divergent genres cross-pollinate and form new sounds. It was really about developing a space organically and seeing where it would go from there. So I think it is important to point out that Coos was not just a place for white indie rockers. It was a place where genres and cultures converged and formed. How much time? 5 minutes? Okay. I might have to skip my second narrator. Basically, I wanted to say, there's a wealth of community programs that Coos brought together: Food Not Bombs, Riot Girl, all these different programs. So it was based on music, but it was based on helping the community too. They gave a home to so many kids who were looking for stuff to do. Kids who didn't always have the greatest home to go back to would go to Coos, and that would be their after-school hangout. And these kids worked on booking, they made flyers, they were all a part of bringing in these bands. So that's what's really important about Coos. Chris Fahey is from Our House, and he's another individual that I interviewed. Because I don't have that much time, I'm not going to go so much into his story. But he found this place down by the tracks called Our House. It was actually the guy who owned Wahoo's Fish Tacos. He approached him and said, "We have nowhere to do shows. I'm tired of acting like I'm a roadie or making believe I'm a roadie and sneaking into 21 Up shows. So can you help us out?" So they booked Supernova. I think that was their first show, and it went off from there. And that became this, interestingly, this little venue known for having Jonathan Richman from the Modern Lovers there. So he kind of formed his little niche there. And Chris, he had this similar motivations. He was a little different in his approach. He wanted a stage. He wanted a really legitimate sound system. So he kind of made it more of a venue, and he made a little backstage area. So he really transformed this space into more of a club versus what Our House was, which is like a living room where bands played. So in closing, just to get at some of this, to take down this orange curtain, So with places like Coos and Our House, the orange curtain began to lift or fall down. Main Street Santa Ana was virtually a ghost town before Coos opened. During its first weeks of operation, residents were shocked to see people around after dark. The opening of Coos caused the first wave of bringing arts to Santa Ana. Dennis ponders the orange curtain stigma and remembers bands playing in both locations states eventually broke right through it. Grassroots venue operators like Chris and Dennis erased the idea of an orange curtain. Fahey laughs at the notion, "Oh, you're behind the orange curtain? No, I don't have to go to L.A. We're putting on shows right here, so we don't have to drive to L.A." Chris, with the help of others in the music community, created a localized music scene. So it's not hard to connect the dots in closing of the grassroots music venues in Orange County back to the network of juke joints, juke houses that have been fostering early musical genres in early American history. For decades, musicians and their aficionados have demanded a place to be entertained. The lack of venues propelled these individuals to carve out space organically. And to end, to quote, I think Pete Seeger sums it up, everything that I'm trying to articulate today, in his song, God Bless the Grass. He says, "God bless the grass that breaks through the cement. It's green and it's tender and it's easily bent. But after a while it lifts up its head, for the grass is living and the stone is dead." God bless the grass. In the 90s, amongst the concrete of Orange County, there was no stopping Dennis Huey and Chris Fahey.
Does anybody have any questions? Ned? Of course, Ned. Orange County, all right.
Well, you know, and having attended shows at those venues and things like this, I still remember just walking through one show at Coos where there was this one little weedy guy playing guitar, singing along rather whinily, and there were a couple of people staring at him adoringly. I just walked outside, this Bright Eyes band is not going to go anywhere. And I'm like, full orchestra, what? So just a quick two-parter. First, it is interesting, of course, that both Dennis and Chris just became eventually, perhaps inevitably, power players in the live scene. Of course, Dennis has the O's Theater, and Chris was instrumental with transforming Club Mesa into the Detroit Bar as a venue to get in, although, of course, other people like John Mercer helped really improve the booking even more, Chris being fantastic as it was. But I guess my sort of related, more a follow-on is to see how that same sort of spirit, trying to do your own thing and all that, translates into not only other venues, but newer generations. The one I'm most familiar with is based at UC Irvine. Acrobatics Every Day, are you aware of that?
Yeah, I don't know that one, actually.
Okay, yeah. Let me tell you right now, if you're doing a project, you want to talk to them, because they're some of the ones who are doing things now. What's interesting about them, and I'd be interested to see how much more of this is playing out, is they're not really locked down to a specific venue site. It's more free-floating wherever we can do something.
Yep.
They used UC Irvine as a place to put on a variety of shows, but they're also doing house shows and other things like this. They just had Calvin Johnson of Beat Happening and K Records down for like a one-off house show, essentially, a couple of weeks ago, and things like this in one of the collective members' locations and things like that. So it's interesting to see how it's less a question of a specific location as where they can get away with stuff. Really.
Right, exactly.
So anyway, but
yeah, and I think that's what the early, before Coos, that's what it was. It was like this movable feast, where can we do this and get away with it? And so, yeah, I'd be interested in talking to you more about that.
Yeah, when you get a chance.
Yeah.
Derek, very quick question. Someone who's actually listening from Seattle wants to know, how do you spell Coos?
K-O-O-S.
Okay, thank you.
And that was the name of they just kept the name of the restaurant.
All right. Ricci, you ready?
Actually, I had to restart the computer.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, then to buy us some time, Derek, I had a question about maybe if you could draw some parallels and talk about some similarities and contrasts between the scene you were talking about and Jabberjaw, since it seemed like there was a lot of...
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, and you can maybe grab that microphone so we can pick that up for the live stream.
Oh, yeah. So I think the thing that struck me the other night, listening to the story about Jabberjaw, was I guess the drug culture that seemed to be
that was actually pretty prevalent in the stories that were being mentioned.
Yeah, it really was, and I didn't pick up much on that in Coos, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if that's just the neighborhoods it was in, or what, or if there was. And I guess the thing musically, the big distinction. and I haven't researched this thoroughly yet, but off the top of my head, I feel like Coos was a little more emo-driven, sort of those emo pop bands, whereas Jabberjaw was just like all that like the Golden Triangle they spoke of, like Unwound in the Pacific Northwest really came down and fed it. I mean, Nirvana played it.
Do you think that both of those issues though were tied to time, like the drug issue
Yes.
and the genre issue are both probably tied to the time?
Yeah. Definitely, it could be. I think the big thing with Coos too that probably makes it different too is that the community organizations that they brought in and these benefits they had. They actually even had the Black Panther Party resurged and came down and did an event there. They had one thing I really wanted to mention was this graffiti wall. Because graffiti art was obviously the authorities were cracking down on that, and they designated a wall for graffiti artists to come and do their thing, and they would change it every month. And then they would also have breakdancing, so breakdancing clubs would come in and be able to express that. So lots of just providing an outlet for lots of different groups.
Yeah. Well, it seems so far, and I imagine this will continue through the rest of the panel, but the recurring theme is a lot of just creating spaces where there are none. So if there's something that you're wanting to do, just going out and doing it. And honestly, it seems to be sort of continuing from the Wednesday event too, where it's just like there's a scene that is sort of wanting to be born essentially, and people just being inspired to just go ahead and create it, and doing so in whatever means possible, whether it be like writing a song about Jesus so that you can play at a church, or just creating any sort of like musical schools or whatever it is that you need to do just to get the scene going. So I don't know if we've got the computer up and running. Almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really driven by the people who wanted to create it. So, I mean, Dennis remarked saying, if they wanted ballet, we would have given them ballet. So it was all their ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I do think that when art feels necessary like that, when it feels so crucial and vital, it seems like that's, I don't know, like that's when the most important art gets made. I feel like, I don't know, maybe that's because that's sort of the movement that I feel like I'm a part of right now. I don't know, but yeah, it seems like really, I don't know, all of these movements seem so crucial, and like they're part of something that's really important that's going on, especially as like all of the arts programs are being cut and there aren't music classes happening in school. So it's really interesting seeing all these different scenes that are taking place in different parts and different eras, but they're all a part of like an ongoing evolution of music.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we're ready.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay.
So let me give you your introduction first, and then if you want to grab the microphone. So Ricci Garcia is a graduate student in U.S. and Latin American history at California State University, Long Beach. During the week, he teaches at the Los Angeles Unified School District, and on weekends, he is in the crowd at punk shows across the Southland.
Okay, hello everybody. Again, my name is Ricci, and the title for my project is Border Hopping Hardcore, Latino Punks and the Forming of a Trans-Border Popular Culture Revolutionary Subjectivity on the Los Angeles, Tijuana, California borderlands from 1974 to 1999. So basically I'm covering the beginning of the punk scene in the 70s, going across to 1999. And on January 30th, 1994, in the middle of intensifying global economic transformations, an internationally observed indigenous-based uprising in Mexico, and escalating xenophobia in the United States, a Los Angeles Times journalist observed, Pan-American punk rockers from all over Latin America are finding power in their own words and tunes these days, and the world is listening. By the end of the decade, in October 1999, on the eve of a concert in support of the Ejército Zapatista Liberación Nacional, or EZLN, Subcomandante Marcos, spokesperson for the Zapatistas, addressed a roundtable forum thanking in particular post-hardcore punk bands Rage Against the Machine, Oxlaw Underground, and Tijuana No, as well as Mexico City's Punk Anarchy Collective. Speaking to the roundtable's theme, from the underground culture to the culture of resistance, bridging Zapatismo and punk, Marcos explained, perhaps what had happened here, there was a meeting. There were words that met, but above all, there were and are feelings that met. If there are songs from these groups that could easily appear to be communiques, and if there are communiques that could be lines to songs, it is not by virtue of who is writing them. No, it is because they are saying the same thing. They are reflecting the same thing, that underground other, which by being different organizes itself in order to exist. However, before Rage Against the Machine, and Tijuana No, and Not Underground, those are the albums that they released right after the Zapatista uprising. And punk culture intersected with the anarchist politics of the EZLN. There was already a longer history linking anarchism, Latino youth, and punk subculture. Examining the performances, recordings, and participation in the scene and the forming of Latina punk transborder solidarity from LA to TJ, this paper demonstrates how a longer history of Latina involvement in punk was galvanized in support of the EZLN uprising, forming an alternative civic imagination that transcended the definition of the state. Now, and refashioned punk subculture's revolutionary subjectivity and established punk culture at the forefront of the anti-globalization movement. In LA, which is seen as a third wave of punk behind New York and the UK, the subculture sprawled like the cityscape. The Zeros, the Bags, the Blasters, the Germs, X, Black Randy, who then changed his name to Mexican Randy, Nervous Gender, and the Plugs. And for a while, an ethnically diverse Black Flag made up the LA scene. In Mexico, punk surfaced in the middle of the nation's collapsing economy and the expanding gap between rich and poor. Young, angry, disillusioned, and a Mexican working class sensibility that was fundamental to the nation's revolutionary mythology, punk was defined in the way one lived. Now, in LA, Latino punks, the Plugs, covered La Bamba in 1978. And actually, this song reveals a wider role of Latinos in forming punk. The Plug singer Tito Larriba added the lyrics to La Bamba. He added, "Zurrados capitalistas, más bien fascistas, yo no soy fascista, soy anarquista," in the translations of it. While the Sex Pistols sang about anarchy in the UK, the borderland cities of LA and Tijuana had a history of anarchism of their own. Secondly, the original Richie Valens rock and roll cover of La Bamba locates Latinos as elemental to the roots of garage rock, and later punk. And lastly, the Plugs version established Latinos and Latinas as foundational participants in the history of LA punk. Moreover, the Plugs and La Bamba were intimately involved in what came to be known as the Elks Lodge Massacre, marked as the incident that transformed and politicized LA punk. In the middle of the show, the Plugs said at Elks Lodge on St. Patrick's Day 1979, which included an opening set by the Latino Punks as Zeros, upwards of 50 LAPD officers arrived in full riot gear. Arriba announced into the mic, "We'll play one that the pigs can pogo along with," and then began La Bamba spitting out the anarchist lyrics. And while Arriba was screaming against capitalism and pronouncing himself an anarchist, he and the participating youth were recalling a longer history of radical transnational Latino identity on the US-Mexican borderland. Whereas the notion of revolution, working class, and anarchy resonate with the history of the Mexican Revolution, in LA, anarchism also had a lineage going back to Ricardo Flores Magón. The Mexican anarchists, after fleeing Mexico in the early decade of 1900s, established themselves on 4th Street in LA and continued publishing the anarchist Regeneración. The slogan Tierra en Libertad, which people commonly confuse with Zapata, was actually coined in LA. And that's the term that EZLN eventually uses in the 90s. But additionally, not only did the Magonistas occupy TJ for a short while, they also had a 5-acre commune in LA called Edendale, around the Silver Lake area. Eventually, LAPD kicked them out after about 8 months, but they were there. And but that's one thing. La Bamba is connected to anarchy. And then the second one, La Bamba is also connected to garage rock. While Latinos were not only an established part of anarchist organizing on the borderlands, in the decades since the inception of rock and roll, Latino youth were elemental to the initial forming of punk. Connecting Latinos to garage rock and later punk, famed journalist Lester Bangs from Rolling Stone wrote, "Just consider Valens' 3-chord mariachi square up on La Bamba, In the Light of Louie Louie by the Kingsmen, then You Really Got Me by the Kinks, and then No Fun by the Stooges, then Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones. And finally, note that Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones sounds a lot like La Bamba. 20 years of rock and roll history and 3 chords played more primitively each time they are recycled. Yet, while Valen's La Bamba changes and Richard Berry's Afro-Cuban rhythms of a Loco Cha-Cha and Louie Louie were foundational to the forming of garage rock and later punk, Latino garage rock band Question Mark and the Mysterians were actually categorized as punk in the 1970 issue of Cream magazine. I think I have the quote right there, somewhere there. Border Latinos were even significant in New York. The iconic Ramones eagle logo, worn by punks worldwide, see right here at the bottom, was designed by Arturo Vega, native to Chihuahua, Mexico. When the Ramones recorded their debut, they did one cover song, Chris Montez's Let's Dance, further connecting Latinos to the origins of punk. The third part of the Plugs La Bamba was their importance to the LA scene. With their debut, Electrify Me, the band established themselves in the LA scene. However, like other prominent LA punk bands, the Zeros, as well as members of X, Tito Larriba was not from LA. He was also born, like Arturo Vega, on the Tex-Mex border in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico. The Plugs were part of the diverse LA, developing a roots punk sound along with X and the Blasters, but with the border sensibility of English and Spanish lyrics. The Plugs are also recognized as one of the early do-it-yourself punk bands in the scene, founding the independent label Fatima Records. But another important set of punks in LA were the Zeros. Though they were referred to as the Mexican Ramones, they helped establish the LA scene, being the first band to perform at the famed Mask. However, they were from San Diego, and their first show as the Zeros was not in LA, but in Ensenada, just south of Tijuana. Moreover, singer Javier Escobedo was also native to the Tex-Mex border, and bassist Hector was actually native to Tijuana. So you can see half the band was native to Mexico. In Ensenada, the Young Zeros covered songs by the Velvet Underground and the surf band, the Shantays. But just north of Ensenada, Tijuana was a mecca of rock and roll since the 50s. At places like Mike's Bar, one could hear Valen's La Bamba and garage rock songs like Louie Louie. And they were also well known as radio waves crossed over the border. And Tijuana had a lot of American tourists. However, while Mexican youth had participated in rock and roll since the 50s, by the 70s, with the chaos of Bandero, considered Mexican's Woodstock, rock and roll culture in Mexico was increasingly demonized and publicly denounced by the government in the 1970s, an era referred to as La Larga Noche for rock culture. At that point, rock and roll took root in the rapidly growing working class colonias, away from the eyes of authorities. The subculture developed a strong underground scene later called rock contestario that was associated with Desmadre and the groups of delinquent youth known as Los Chavos Banda. When punk surfaced in magazines in the late 1970s, the subculture's working class identification caught on rapidly with an already established working class rock subculture. And while the highly commercialized Ramones and the Sex Pistols were of course at the forefront of influencing the nascent punk scene in Tijuana, bands and images from LA were also making their way into Mexico. By the early 1980s, El Hardcore explained Mexican punk, Ana Loren, nos llegó de los Estados Unidos y bien rápido. Había un disco clásico, and she refers to the classic film, The Decline of Western Civilization. And she says that que tienen varios grupos, vienen los X, Alice Bag Band, los Fear, o sea, música más salvaje. So basically there was X, Alice Bag, and Fear, and also just music that sounded a lot more savage, she says. Filmed from 1979-1980, The Decline was a major influence spurring hardcore in the borderlands. Alice Bags was featured on as both a member of the Alice Bag Band and Catholic Discipline. Also featured was the first band labeled hardcore, which is Black Flag. But as the writers of a book called White Riot say, before the quintessential angry white man Henry Rollins made his name and garnered fame as a frontman for Black Flag, there was Ron Reyes, the Puerto Rican singer who belted out one of the band's best-known songs, White Minority. In addition to Ron Chavo Pederes Reyes, which was a nickname, Black Flag also consisted of drummer Colombian-American Robo and singer guitarist Mexican-American Des Cadena. And like Ron Reyes' influential run with Black Flag, Des Cadena also made his mark on hardcore. Adding some of his own lyrics, Cadena covered the iconic garage rock song Louie Louie, returning the song back to its LA roots, which the Kingsmen had made famous in the Northwest. Moreover, out of the editors, Greg Ginn and Ian McKay would have had a hard time inventing hardcore in LA and DC without spending their nights getting psyched about the bags. With vocalist Alice Bags and the all black Bad Brains respectively. And Alice Bags would say, "I am nobody's victim," adding, "I very often confuse people who get in my face with punching bags. You can take a girl out of East LA, but you can't take East LA out of the girl." However, emulating the larger process of spatial segregation in LA, in the late 70s and 80s, Latino punks were increasingly segregated from the punk rock circuit. This was illustrated when Johnny Rotten toured through LA in 1980 with the new band Public Image. With a crowd full of punks at the Olympic Auditorium, his openers, Los Lobos, and Los Plugs were pelted with trash and saliva. At the same time, the up-and-coming Latino punk band The Brat, with lead singer Teresa Covarrubias, were quickly categorized, like the Zeros, as a brown blondie. In response, a group of Latino punks founded their own punk club in East LA, The Vex. First established in 1980, and not only did it provide space for barrio punks, a place to congregate a few times a month, but the Art Center had a longer history in Latino radicalism and association with the Chicano movement. Opening the club were the Los Illegals, the Brat, the Fender Buddies, and the Plugs, performing with songs like L.A. Los Illegals intersected Chicano politics with the punk scene. Moreover, with the growing racial tension in the scene, Latino punks like the Brat, the Plugs, and Felix and the Cat, who was from Tecate, Mexico, were increasingly intersecting the politics of punk, contributing to compilations in the East Side. But the fight over space and place in LA and the borders was evident in the growing racial conflicts in the scene. Reinforcing Latinos punks as foreigners and criminal border crossers, references such as taco punk and wetback were symptomatic of the nativism spreading through the scene. Mike Muir of Suicidal Tendencies said, "These guys followed TSOL, very middle class to rich beach kids who had a real pack mentality, prone to chicken shit style jumps, and generally regarded by the older Hollywood LA folks as tourists, assholes fucking things up for everyone." But with the Suicidal Tendencies' success, racial tensions in the scene grew worse. Muir says when they went up from opening to headlining, and that's when these bands, they've been bands for 4 years, he says, they were going Suicidal Tendencies, fucking wetbacks. The Brats, Teresa Covarrubias, also experienced similar racial tension and attacks. However, Latino signs were increasingly surfacing in punk. Alice Bags' fashion in the late 70s referenced Pachuca culture. San Fernando's The Dickies had recorded the humorous song I'm a Cholo, and next scribbled Cholo graffiti on the Brats album. Even more, Ruben Guevara explained, if you want to talk about punks, you've got to talk about East LA, because the real true punks, the real outcasts are the people with something to bitch about, aren't middle-class white kids. They're the cholos, man. You want to talk about injustice? Hey, it's been here ongoing for the last 50 years. Not only that, but the Brat also appeared on a Lowrider cover. Let's see. But throwing the violence, though the violence signaled the end of the hardcore in LA, there was also a growing connection between politics of punk and Latino border identity. You would have suicidal t-shirts across MTJ, you would see those, pretty ubiquitous. Tijuana fanzines like Virus Rojo were known for their anarchist politics. Universo Suburbano, another fanzine, was dual language, so it would go to both sides of the border. El Cejas, who was a member of Solución Mortal, actually the original guitarist was Solución, moved to LA and established anarchist punk band Dogma Mundista. And the Brat spoke to the larger connections across the borders with the song Wolf. Also, with the growing violence in Central America, there was more connection between these punks. But getting to the final issue here, the connection between punks and the EZLN. In Tijuana, hardcore punks scene that spawned Solución Mortal, the hardcore band from TJ, gave way to Tijuana No. In late '88, Tijuana No came together with Long Beach native Julieta Venegas and manager of Solución Mortal, Luis Guerena, formed Tijuana No. At the same time, with songs like Cowboys Asesinos and Niños de la Calle, as well as collaborations with European punk, Manu Chao, and bilingual lyrics, the early 90s debut spoke to punks on both sides of the border. In LA, anarchist punks Iconoclast disbanded and formed Aztlan Underground. Similarly, Inside Out disbanded, hardcore band Inside Out disbanded, and Zach de la Rocha came back, likewise mixing Chicano politics with hip-hop and hardcore punk, and re-emerged as Rage Against the Machine. Their self-titled album was not only explicitly political, speaking to the issues that ignited the LA riots, but the band aligned themselves with the Chicano politics and DIY notion of hardcore. In the back of the liner notes, they actually thank the Chicano movement art group Los Cuatro, the Mohawk Nation, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and the Clash's Joe Strummer. But in 1994, in the early 90s, converging with the 500-year anniversary of Columbus and the subsequent genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and the EZLN uprising in '94 revealed the families of resemblance between Latinos and the border and the new economy and the struggles for self-determination. In '94, finally, Tijuana No releases Transgresores de la Ley. Inside the album, he juxtaposes a picture of Emiliano Zapata with EZLN. There are songs like La Esquina del Mundo and Gringos Ku Klux Klanes, recognizing the militarization of the border. The band brings attention to the violence of the U.S. aggression and calls for open borders. The same year at the Olympic Auditorium with Rage Against the Machine, there was the LA Big Tops Locals Festival, which benefited United Farm Workers. And the following year, Tijuana No played the second annual Big Top Locals Festival, dubbed the Rock for Children of Chiapas. The LA Times ran an article with the headline saying, Chicano alternative rock and rockeros and Español find common ground in concert planned in Chiapas, which large portraits of Che Guevara and Subcomandante Marcos hung from the stage. Tijuana No, Los Illegals, Voodoo Gloscos, Los Olvidados, and Youth Brigade provided a space for alternative views to the growing politics of violence in the border and the ravages of neoliberal globalization. In 1995, Aztlan Underground released their debut album, Decolonize. The post-punk band's album cover had a painting of cholos that actually had Nike Cortez painted on them. They were on horses stabbing pigs. And a picture of the Zapatistas were in the liner notes. A dedication to the EZLN also that says, that remarks, the indigenous revolutions, and the slogan was on there that says, we didn't cross the borders crossed us. In the years between Rage Against the Machine's debut and Evil Empire in '96, Propositions 187 and 209 were aimed at terrorizing a growing Latino population. And the first two songs on Evil Empire, People of the Sun and Bulls on Parade, set the tone for the album, pointing to the connection between contemporary Latino labor and indigenous peoples in the era of NAFTA. In the liner notes, not only do they thank the EZLN, they also include a spread of radical books with, as you can see up there, with Che Guevara's Guerrilla Warfare, a study of Antonio Gramsci's Hegemony and Revolution, and a Rebellion from the Roots about the EZLN, and in the center, the Anarchist Cookbook. The recordings that followed those three from Tijuana No, Rage Against the Machine, Aztlan Underground, were followed up with Tijuana No's Contra Revolucion Avenue, Aztlan Underground, Subverses, and in '99, Rage Against the Machine's Battle of LA. And again, all of them spoke to police abuse, labor exploitation, immigration, and the revolutionary politics of the EZLN. The process intersecting Latino border youth with punk, anarchism, and indigenous identity culminated in the public display of support for the EZLN in the Battle of Mexico City on October 28, 1999. Additionally, when Rage Against the Machine released a video of Battle of Mexico with the cover of Campesinos, it also included an interview with anarchist Noam Chomsky. I would even argue that the now famous name for the anti-globalization protest battle of Seattle was inspired by Rage Against the Machine's album and their association with the punk, anarchism, and the EZLN. At the same time, there were also compilations speaking to the larger transborder connection between Latino punks. In LA, the independent punk label BYO Records released a '97 compilation, Sociedad Suciedad, with Latino post-punk bands. Spanglish 101 in '99 with special guest Jello Biafra as California Governor Pito Wilson, and in Mex America in 2001 with songs like Breaking Down Borders and Mexica Chicano Connection joined LA and Tijuana punks. Sometimes on the same track, even. In the past 10 years, there has been the Latino Punk Fest in East LA, Tijuana punks helping organize the arrival of the EZLN in 2006. And when Occupy LA rose up in 2011, it resurrected LA's anarchist past as Aslan Underground performed to support the movement. There were certainly banners that read Tierra en Libertad. Moreover, when Ruben Martinez brought his ballad of Ricardo Flores Magón to the Henry Ford Theater last year, on the program for the evening were the LA Punks, Los Illegals, and Tijuana Knows, Ceci Bastida. And finally, while the impact of Latinos in punk may not be obvious to us here, to punks from other countries it was. I have two quotes from punks from the UK, and the first one says, I always thought Hispanics were the working class punks in America, explained Welly, the roadie for Chaos UK, adding, their anger was real. It was what white suburban bands were writing about while munching on the Twinkies. Whenever I was at the gig in Southern California, the Latino kids were always the craziest dancers and the most dedicated followers of the bands, it seemed. Similarly, John Robb of the UK's Membranes defined punk rock as outsider music for outsider communities and saw Latino punks as a true definition of punk rock. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Does anybody have any questions for Ricci? All right. I think Alice Stagg just recently wrote a book and actually covered a lot of that stuff. But I think a lot of those bands had been neglected in a lot of the coverage because there was a lot of stuff in like We Got the Neutron Bomb and Decline in Western Civilization. You hear a lot about the West LA punk scene, but you don't really hear a lot of any of the East LA bands like the Zeros or Plugs or Los Legos or anything like that. So or the Brat. Which a lot of those bands only put out like an EP or didn't put out much of anything, so it's kind of cool to hear a lot of history of the other bands, like a parallel history. Actually, just recently taught a workshop about a lot of those bands. Like
A lot of bootlegs, right?
Yeah, a lot of bootlegs. Actually, what's cool is now that YouTube, you can like see a lot of videos of those bands and stuff, and everybody's doing the little mini reunion one-off shows and things like that. So,
more recently.
Yeah, so it's always cool to be able to see some of that stuff.
What's actually interesting is that when I started doing this project a couple years ago, there wasn't too many flyers on the internet. Now there's all kinds of flyers.
Everybody's uploading a lot of cool stuff, and the Zeros have actually been doing shows recently too. I think I caught them a couple years ago at a Power Pop festival, and I forget his name, the guy who does the Elvis.
Robert Lopez.
Yes, Robert Lopez. Yeah, he's always great. So yeah, so you can see a lot of those East LA punk bands performing.
Or even if you want, you can go down to South Central LA and catch punk shows now.
That's true. Yeah, you can see the current bands as well. But if you haven't, I would actually recommend checking out Alice Bagg's book if you haven't, because there's actually a lot of history of these shows and of those bands. And it's a pretty cool story from somebody who was there, and there's a lot of these stories that are told, and a lot of them.
What actually I found interesting was the book Neutron Bomb, about the LA punk scene. In the chapter about East LA, those logos are on that page.
Right, yeah. And they actually don't get recognized as being a part of that scene very often, but they were. They were a big part of that.
Well, they opened up for public image.
Right, yeah. Okay, Areum, are you ready? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Areum. Areum Jeong is a doctoral candidate in theater and performance studies at University of California in Los Angeles. Her dissertation explores national identificatory strategies, that was a mouthful, that Maya practices of visual media and processes of cultural translation in live performances. Her research interests include Asian performance art, feminist theory, film and visual culture, theories of identification, and narratology.
Hi, thank you for coming. I will start with a short clip of Gangnam Style. Although I'm sure many of you have seen this video, it would be great if you could pay attention to the translation of the lyrics. Okay, thanks.
오빠 Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. 낮에는 따사로운 인간적인 여자, 커피 한 잔에 여유 아는 품격 있는 여자, 밤이 오면 심장이 뜨거워지는 여자, 그런 반전 있는 여자. 너만 사랑해, 낮에는 너만큼 따사로운 걸 사랑해, 커피 시키고 저녁 원샷해서 사랑해, 밤이 오면 심장이 터져버리는 사랑해, 그런 사랑해.
Released in mid-July 2012, Korean rapper Psy's Gangnam Style became the most watched YouTube video of all time, earning more than 800 million hits. Countless parodies of the Korean sensation's dance moves are seen not only via YouTube, but also through various mediums and flash mobs all over the world. Despite its global flame, Gangnam Style did not target international audiences during its initial making. Unlike other K-pop musicians that strive to ride with the Korean wave, Psy has been regarded as a local musician performing for more than 10 years in Korea. In addition, the lyrical context of Gangnam Style shows to be strictly local, parodying an aspect of South Korean culture. Yet, Gangnam Style has offered a means to individualize local cultures elsewhere, extending the level of parody from pleasure to satire to political activism and protests. This paper explores both the locality and transnationality in Gangnam Style, how the long tradition of satire in pre-modern Korean theater is seen in the lyrics, and how these Gangnam Style's parodies can be viewed as choreographies of protest, utilizing a physicality that constructs both individual agency and sociality, implementing a tactics of non-violent direct action. In Gangnam Style, Psy plays a Gangnam man lampooning the self-importance and ostentatious wealth of Gangnam, a small neighborhood in Seoul, Korea. And this is an area that takes up only like 15 square miles. Gangnam, which is one of Korea's wealthiest neighborhoods, takes up 7% of the entire country's GDP and can be seen to represent the materialist culture of Korea. Psy seems to parody this so-called Gangnam life. For example, he claims that he can drink a whole cup of coffee in one gulp and wants a woman who also drinks coffee. This cultural reference to coffee may seem unfamiliar to viewers outside of Korea. Since the mid-1990s, the number of coffee shops has gone up tremendously in Seoul, particularly in Gangnam. According to the Starbucks Korea webpage, among the 252 Starbucks stores in Seoul, there are approximately 45 stores located just in Gangnam. A recent report from the USDA Foreign Agriculture Services Coffee Market Brief Update shows that Koreans have to pay nearly twice or maybe 3 times as much for Starbucks coffee as Americans do. Certain coffee shops has become the place where people go to be seen and spend ridiculous amounts of money. There's even a joke poking fun at Korean women who spend money on a cup of coffee that is nearly twice or 3 times the price of a meal. They are called 된장녀, which means soybean paste women, for their propensity to crimp on essentials so they can spend on conspicuous luxuries, of which coffee is one of the most common. A visualization of the lyrics, Psy hits several aspects of this Gangnam opulence in the video, but each turns out to be something much more modest, as if suggesting that Gangnam Style wealth is not as fabulous as it might seem. The opening shot of the video, which seems like a beach, turns out to be a sandy playground. Psy struts through the parking garage with 2 ladies outside as trash and snow fly at them, which seems to refer to the common trope of the star walking down the red carpet. Psy dances not in a club but on a bus with middle-aged tourists. He is seen in a sauna not with big-shot businessmen, but with mobsters, and meets his love interest in the subway. However, none of this commentary is particularly overt, which actually makes this Gangnam Style video so subversive. Social commentary through nuanced satire has a long history in pre-modern Korean theater. In a study of the history of Korean theater, Ha Jin-sil writes that soakji, which is a style of Korean theater, is performed by the performer himself, does not use props, makes the audience laugh using particular figures or issues, critical and satirical, and improvised to a certain extent. Because this theater style provokes laughter through both carnivalesque parody and aggressive criticism, Sa contends that careful preparation is necessary in order to achieve what it means. And such performance strategy has inspired other parts of the world to make use of the Gangnam Style dance in political ways. And next is a clip by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei.
Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. 낮에는 따사로운 인간적인 여자 커피 한 잔에 여유하는 품격 있는 여자 밤이 오면 심장이 뜨거워지는 여자 그런 반전 있는 여자 너만 선호해 낮에는 너만큼 따사로운 걸 선호해 커피 시키고 전에 원샷해줘 선호해 밤이 오면 심장이 터져버리는 선호해 그런 선호해 난 매워 상스러워 그래 너 바로 너 난 매워 상스러워 그래 너
Okay, I just wanted to bring you guys to the point where he brings up the handcuffs from his pockets. So Ai Weiwei exposes the absurdity of the Chinese government seeking to promote creativity while maintaining its strict censorship laws. The artist, who mimics the horse-riding dance moves while wearing handcuffs, calls his own version the grass mud horse style, which refers to a fictional character used to symbolize anti-censorship in China. Ai Weiwei's video quickly went viral but was removed from Chinese website from the government. In response, Anish Kapoor, the Indian-born British artist, invited hundreds of his friends to his London studio to create their own video as a sign of support and asked individual institutions like the Museum of Modern Arts in New York and so on around the globe to participate. In the press release, Anish Kapoor explained that the film aims to make a serious point about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. International Human Rights Day on December 17, 2012, Cambodian human rights activists performed a choreographed dance to a land rights-themed version singing "Stop Evicting Us, We Have Land Rights" in front of the country's National Assembly. These activists wore T-shirts signed by over 10,000 Cambodians protesting forced evictions by the government to make room for lodging and other agribusiness and development concessions, usually to foreign-owned companies. And the last clip is just so that you have an idea. And most recently, the people of the Henan province in China filmed a video to bring attention to the Communist Party practice of digging up graves to make way for farmland. Over 2 million graves have been desecrated by this practice. And in this video, the altered lyrics explain that the opposition to the campaign not only stems from cultural preservation, but also the social divide in China that separates the powerful who lives in luxurious homes to the powerless who does not have a place to live while alive nor a place to rest when dead. Such parodies can be seen as a social performance through decision-making in which the participant's bodily presence is necessarily desired. In her article, Choreographies of Protest, Susan Lee Foster examines the nonviolent protests of the lunch counter sit-ins of 1960, the ACT UP die-ins of the late 1980s, and the WTO meetings protest in Seattle, Washington in 1999. Foster posits an argument against several assumptions towards such protests, the inefficacy of spontaneity of such actions, and the dismissal of the bodies in these events, either by conceptualizing protest as a practice that erupts out of bodily anger over which there's no control, or by envisioning it as a practice that uses the body only as an efficacious instrument that can assist in maximizing efficacy. Susan Lee Foster argues for the physicality that constructs both individual agency and sociality through her examination of these three protests. Throughout her article, she analyzes how each protest implemented a tactics of nonviolent direct action for which bodies rehearse specific procedures of non-cooperation. Foster's notion of choreography enables one to look at social construction through decision-making and how that act negotiates within a field that is located historically and culturally. The presence of the bodies in a particular space is especially significant as Foster is interested in looking at bodies as signified entities, dance as signifying practices, and choreography as a form of theorizing. In relation to Foster's work, I argue that such parodies of Gangnam Style can be viewed as a tactics for nonviolent direct action through its choreography of preparation, which creates a space for a political performance. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Areum?
Could you say a little more about this idea of presence with Foster in the videos? Because it seems that a lot of what Foster talks about is the physical presence of the bodies. So how does that translate into a digital medium?
Well, I'm using Foster's idea of choreography and how one prepares for nonviolent direct action through careful preparation and theorizing. So it eliminates a lot of the spontaneity that people think of when they're dealing with political protest. And in these videos, if you look at, you could obviously see that these people have been rehearsing these dance moves, and they have prepared and theorized what they're going to do, such as, for example, if there are police barricaded all over, what are they going to do if there's police and if something breaks out. So you could see how they prepared not only the dance moves, but also their costumes and makeup and everything in order to maximize the efficacy of these protests. And that's where I'm using Foster's idea.
Yes? I wanted to understand better when these things happen, because I'm not familiar with all of these examples that you brought up, which are all really interesting. I'm just curious to know, when, the timeline of when these videos came out.
Yes. So Gangnam Style was released in mid-July 2012, And shortly after that, Ai Weiwei made his own video, which I think was around the time like October, November of 2012. And then it was removed by the Chinese government, and then Anish Kapoor immediately released his own video. And the Cambodian version was made on December 17, 2012. And the last one of protesting the grave digging was after that. So, sorry I didn't bring the exact data, but I think it's sometime between January and February. So it's pretty recent, yes.
Thank you.
In the various clips that you showed, there was often a male lead. However, in the Cambodian clip, it was mostly women. Is there a reason for that? Was it a mostly women's movement, or was it just women in the clip?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I didn't really focus on the genders going on, gender bodies going on in the video, but that would be really interesting for me to go back and look at it.
And at this point, if anybody has any questions for any of our panelists, this would be the time.
It's not so much a question, but I guess an observation of at least 3, and maybe all 4 papers, which is coming back to the theme of sort of locality. What's interesting, especially thinking about the Cambodian clip, thinking about especially Derek's discussion of these performance spaces and a lot of informal performance spaces in Orange County. I think this would also bleed over to parts of Ricci and Drew's talks. Is the I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jorge Leal's theory of ephemeral forums. He's from Cal State Northridge, and an ephemeral forum is basically a performance space that is not meant to be a performance space, but you basically make use of it because there's no sort of official or sponsored way in which you can have those spaces. So in the case of Cambodia, it's sort of a dance performance in an eviction space, which to me is sort of as dramatic a way of kind of claiming space that doesn't really belong to you, in the same way that turning a backyard into a place to have a concert is something that's not what that space is purposed for, but that's what they sort of end up working with. Again, I don't have a particular question about it, but it just strikes me that so many of your papers, talk about the ways in which, regardless if they're sort of an official or a sanctioned, space in which these performances can take place, artists will just sort of make use of it regardless and just sort of lay claim to it. I don't know if anyone has, thinking about your individual papers, if you want to expand on that at all. But if you do, please speak to the mic. I mean, Drew, if maybe you could start, because with your work in particular.
I actually don't know what to say about it.
Okay.
Sorry. Anybody else?
Yeah. Go ahead. You go ahead, because I'm still forming my thought here.
Well, I think your idea, Oliver, about the space and how the artist uses it and how there's this production of space is really interesting. So I definitely agree to that.
Yeah, and I think it's something I try to look at the built environment and how, as a youth, you look at your built environment around you wherever you happen to sprout up as sort of set, and that's what that space is for this and that space is for that. So I think what's really great is the creativity of these youth culture to manipulate that built environment around them to service their own needs. So like that.
That's by necessity, though.
By necessity,
right? Essentially, yeah.
And I'm really interested in the way that there's digital space that works in the same way, that you can create your own venues there, where you can occupy a space and talk about death metal or whatever you want, any sort of particular interest. So it kind of works in the same way as, instead of occupying a space that's like an old grocery store, there's parts of the internet that you can own too.
Yes, in the back.
To follow up on Oliver's idea, maybe one of the words we need here is official and unofficial space that ties that together. I think that all of these things are reactions, especially the protests, to definitions of official, in that case, literally state-sanctioned space, but also the places that establish kind of the official networks and clubs, or the official networks where culture is supposed to belong. And I think that there's something about literally a policing or surveillance or regulation that ties into this idea of ephemeral space that's useful. You might be able to kind of flesh out a little further. Just as a thought.
Yeah. Let's go here and then there.
This question is for Derek. I'm interested, I grew up in North Orange County, and I was actually curious. In Fullerton, where I grew up, there's been this amazing not amazing, but this dramatic transformation of downtown from
Yes.
a lot of underground venues like the Hub to suddenly being total gentrification. They're possibly building, I think, a House of Blues downtown now. I mean, it's not official, but there's all this talk. I imagine the same thing happened in Santa Ana as well, right? Like, because you're talking about
the arts
90s.
district, yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about this idea of these underground spaces as sort of breaking this new territory, only gentrification going to be usurped later on by groups with money, and
Right.
really two different audiences. And then what happens to those people when they're displaced?
It's a good question. One thing that's I think is unique about Santa Ana is that, and this is, I'm quoting Dennis Huey on this, they didn't plan on what happened as far as like how the art space developed to what it is now. They didn't go in with the intention, well, if we put in a cafe, then that's going to bring in a new condo, and that's going to bring in all this, raise the higher property values. It was very, I guess, trying to say, it was very original to the idea of we just need arts here. It didn't have a motive of gentrification, and that's according to Dennis Huey, and I think that's true about Santa Ana. I don't know much about Fullerton and kind of where that's going. I did not hear about the House of Blues. I do know that, Dennis is now running the Yost Theater, which he has challenges, maintaining that all ages thread. So I think in a sense, his big push is we've got to teach the youth to continue doing this and to continue demanding all ages venues, or it's going to go away, and there's not going to be space anymore for that. So it's interesting to see how he's kind of gone to the 21 and up space now. But yeah, I hope that answers some of your questions.
My point was more going back to Oliver's point, in that it's very interesting to think about, even in the use of unofficial space, that there's still a reasoning behind unofficial space to use, especially in the videos that were shown. There were so many spaces you could use that were unofficial, but it seemed that there was a general purpose behind those, as well as the movements that were in Riverside, that there was a reason they were in Riverside, and even though they used the space, like any space they could, they still had general reasoning behind the general locality, and things like that. So it's interesting to examine the reasoning behind all those things, and you can even do future papers probably on that.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. Well, I think that's the time we have for this panel. So thank you, everybody.